I got divorced and moved to the other side of the country. My ex-wife married her yoga instructor 3 weeks later. 150 guests at a winery in the Okanagan. Everything she'd spent years planning in her head. I was 3,000 kilometers away in a small village in Nova Scotia, drinking coffee on a porch that looked out at the Atlantic. My own son told me I was a coward. My daughter was the only one who understood. Then at their rehearsal dinner, a guest I'd never met raised a glass and asked one simple question that unraveled everything in public. The video, a bridesmaid posted online, hit 2 million views before sunrise. Her perfect new life collapsed under its own weight. 6 hours later, she phoned me, sobbing, threatening, accusing. Thanks for being here today. It means a lot. Quick thing before we get into it, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your town in the comments. I genuinely like reading them. Fair warning. This story has some fictionalized elements for educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people is a coincidence. But the lessons in it, those are as real as anything I've lived. Let's get into it. My name is Douglas Pembridge. I'm 63 years old. And this is the story of how I learned that the quietest thing you can do can also be the loudest. It started in Oakville, Ontario, in a house that photographed beautifully and lived terribly. 1.9 million on a ravine lot. Stone front. The kind of place my ex-wife liked to show off at Christmas. She was an interior designer, fairly successful in the GTA circuit. And she had a gift for making rooms look like catalog pages and making her husband feel like clutter. 32 years I spent in that marriage. 32 years watching the goalposts move every time I got close to them. The kitchen renovated twice in 4 years because the backsplash wasn't speaking to her anymore. My old leather recliner vanished to the garage while I was at a conference in Calgary. And when I asked about it, she laughed and said, "A grown man shouldn't be so attached to furniture." At dinner parties, she'd correct my pronunciation of French wine labels, then pat my arm like I was a boy who'd tried his best. By year 29, I was sleeping in the finished basement. By year 30, I'd stopped trying to figure out which version of me she wanted that week. We had 2 kids. My daughter Margaret, 28, auditor at one of the big firms in Toronto. Asa Blade. Saw through her mother when she was still in high school. Myson Bennett, 25, a junior partner at a consulting firm in Calgary. Smart kid, but he'd bought his mother's story completely. Cold father, emotionally unavailable, checked out. All her words. His mouth. The stroke scare came on a Wednesday in late October. Transient ischemic attack. The doctor called it a warning shot. I was standing at the kitchen island trying to read the Globe and Mail when the right side of my face went numb and the paper in my hand looked like somebody else's language. My ex-wife was upstairs on a call with a fabric rep, debating the difference between oyster and bone. I drove myself to the hospital because I didn't want to interrupt her. I sat in that emergency room in Mississauga under those awful humming lights. And when the neurologist finally came in, she looked at my chart, looked at me, and said, "Mr. Pembridge, your body is trying to tell you something. Are you actually listening?" For the first time in about a decade, they admitted me overnight for observation. My daughter drove in from the city at 11 at night and sat with me until I fell asleep. My son called from Calgary, asked if I was all right, said the right words, but in that flat voice he'd learned from his mother. He said he'd try to come out next month if things settled down at work. I heard my ex-wife in the background at his place on speaker, saying, "He's always been dramatic about his health. Benny, don't cancel anything." That sentence lodged itself in my ribs. The cardiologist, sorry. The neurologist discharged me the next afternoon. My ex-wife didn't come to pick me up. Said she had a client installation, she couldn't move. Margaret drove out from her condo downtown. Brought me a coffee from Tim's and a blueberry muffin. And she didn't say much on the drive back to Oakville. She didn't have to. When we pulled into my driveway, my ex-wife's Lexus wasn't there. The house was empty. Margaret squeezed my shoulder at the door and said, "Dad, you don't have to keep doing this." That night I went down to the basement, turned on the little reading lamp, and opened my laptop. I'd sold my engineering consulting firm 2 years earlier. Small shop. Industrial automation. Mostly clients in the auto sector, around Windsor and Oshawa, for about $4.6 million before tax. The money was sitting in a TFSA, an RRSP I hadn't touched, and a non-registered account with my advisor at RBC. I had a defined benefit pension from an earlier corporate stint that would kick in at 65. I had options. What I didn't have was another 30 years. I gave myself 6 months, November through April. I worked the problem the way I'd worked problems, my whole career quietly, methodically, in pencil first and ink later. I set up a family trust with Margaret as trustee, funded it with roughly $2 million, tied up so tight my ex-wife couldn't see it, let alone touch it. I moved another chunk into a non-registered account in my name only, under a different advisor in Halifax. I talked to a tax lawyer in Toronto about the cross-provincial move and the capital gains timing. I looked at maps of Canada for the first time in years. Really looked, and I thought about where a man could go to hear himself think, not Muskoka too close, not the West Coast too expensive, too familiar. She'd followed me there on vacations. I thought about the coast of Nova Scotia, the lighthouse route south of Halifax, a stretch I'd seen once at a conference 15 years earlier and never forgotten. I flew out in February on the pretext of visiting an old colleague. I drove from Halifax along the South Shore, past Peggy's Cove and Chester and Mahone Bay, and I found a gray shingled salt box in a village called Blue Rocks, just outside Lunenburg, half a kilometer from the water. 3 bedrooms, wood stove, a screened porch, $470,000. I wrote an offer on the kitchen table of a real estate office in Lunenburg before I flew home to Pearson. The house closed at the end of March. The Oakville house was trickier. It was in both our names. Mortgage-free. Worth about 1.9. I didn't fight for it. I had my lawyer draw up a separation agreement that gave my ex-wife the house, the Lexus, the cottage on Georgian Bay that her parents had left her anyway, and a lump sum spousal equalization that was frankly generous. I kept the investment accounts, the trust, the pension, and my engineering library. The paperwork was ready to serve on a specific Tuesday in April. In December, I told Margaret over dinner at a little Italian place on Yonge Street. She listened, put down her wine, and said, "Dad, I've been waiting for this conversation for about 15 years. What do you need from me? I need you to look after your brother." I said, "He's going to take it hard." She nodded. "He's going to take it the wrong way. Dad, he's going to think you abandoned us." "I know," I said, "but I can't keep dying slowly just so he doesn't have to be uncomfortable." I didn't tell Bennett. At 25, he still phoned his mother every Sunday and believed her version of the weather. Maybe one day he'd need to figure it out for himself. I couldn't do it for him. April the 15th, a Tuesday. I left the separation papers on the kitchen counter with a short note. "The mortgage is paid. The utilities are in your name. I've taken my books and my grandfather's barometer. Everything else is yours. I'm fine. Please don't call." I put the note under a mug she'd bought in Provence that summer. She went without me. The cab came at 6 in the morning, and I flew out of Pearson with 2 suitcases and a carry-on full of drafting pencils I hadn't used in years. Somewhere over New Brunswick, I had a black coffee and watched the sunrise light up the Bay of Fundy. And my chest didn't hurt for the first time in months. By the time my ex-wife got home from her Pilates class and found the note, I was standing on the porch in Blue Rocks watching a lobster boat come in around the point. Margaret phoned her that evening to explain what she could. Bennett phoned me 3 days later, and the first word out of his mouth was coward. 6 months later, a phone call I didn't expect would force me into one more decision: protect my son or stay silent and let him take a hit he didn't see coming. I chose truth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first summer in Blue Rocks was the strangest, gentlest stretch of time I'd had since I was a kid. I'd wake up without an alarm, make a pot of coffee, and walk the dirt road down to the water. There's a little general store in Lunenburg where the owner, a woman named Eileen, I knew my order by the end of June, double, and a cinnamon roll. I joined a local woodworking co-op in Mahone Bay. Started making cutting boards out of local maple. Badly at first. Then less badly, I took a boat building class at the Dory shop. Just for the hell of it. My blood pressure, which had been 150/95 in Oakville, came down to 118/72 by August. I lost 17 pounds without trying. I slept through the night for the first time in, I couldn't remember how long. Margaret phoned every Sunday at noon my time. She'd been promoted twice at the firm. Was on track for partner. Bennett hadn't called me once. Margaret said to give him time. I gave him space. Instead, different thing. But close enough. Then on a Tuesday in early October, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea watching the fog burn off the harbor. And my phone buzzed. It was a Facebook message from a guy I hadn't talked to in 20-some years. A former client named Ron Whitaker who'd run a parts supply business in Oshawa. The message was short. Doug. Long time. Hope you're well. Thought you should know your ex is getting married at the end of the month. Guy named Travis Kellerman. Runs a yoga studio chain out in BC. Big Okanagan winery wedding. Figured you'd want to hear it from a friend. I read it twice. Set the phone face down on the porch rail. And finished my tea. I was surprised at what I felt. Which was nothing. Not a flicker. Not a pang. Just mild curiosity. The kind you feel when a movie you walked out on halfway through gets a sequel. I typed back. Appreciated. Ron. Genuinely. I'm doing well, out east. Thanks for thinking of me. Then I made another pot of tea and opened my laptop. Travis Kellerman had a public Instagram with about 90,000 followers. 3 yoga and wellness studios, 1 in Kelowna, 1 in West Vancouver, 1 on Vancouver Island, a line of branded supplements, a podcast. The aesthetic was linen shirts and mountain sunrises, and the word authenticity used like punctuation. My ex-wife was in half the photos over the last 4 months, tagged in captions with language that would have embarrassed a teenager. The wedding venue was a winery outside Naramata. The date was 3 weeks away. There were engagement photos with her new fiancé on a dock. Her laughing. Him looking at the camera. I spent 32 years reading people for a living, not as a therapist. As an engineer who had to tell clients whether their plant was going to stay running or catch fire. You learn to see what's missing. Not just what's presented. Something about Travis Kellerman's whole setup sat wrong with me. 3 studios in 4 years. The supplement line, the rapid expansion, the vague bio that described him as a former corporate executive turned wellness entrepreneur, with no specifics about the corporate part. I pulled up the BC corporate registry. Public information. $5 search. Kellerman Wellness Holdings Limited. Incorporated 2022. Director Travis Kellerman. 2 numbered companies beneath it. I looked at the registered addresses. One was a UPS store in Burnaby. I called a friend from my old industry association. A woman named Linda who'd retired to Vernon and still had good contacts in the interior. I asked her, casually, if she'd ever heard of Kellerman. Long pause. She said, Doug, I wouldn't say this to most people. But yes, there was a thing a few years back. He went by a different surname then. Kellerman. He had a wellness retreat outside Canmore that shut down after a class action from people whose money went into a franchise program that never existed. He settled out of court, changed his last name legally. Moved to BC. My hand got very still on the mug. I spent the next 2 days in front of my laptop, doing what I used to do for a living, following paper, checking foundations. The B.C. Securities Commission had a notice on their site from 18 months ago about a cease trade order against a numbered company that shared a director with Kellerman Wellness Holdings, relating to unregistered offerings to investors. There were CRA liens registered against 2 of the studio locations for unpaid source deductions. There were small claims filings from suppliers in Kelowna, a printer, a signage company, a contractor, each for amounts under $25,000, which is usually how grifters stay under the radar. His podcast sponsors had dried up over the last 6 months, and the Launching Soon tab on his supplement website had been launching soon for a year and a half. Then I found the investor list. Or rather, Margaret found it, because I phoned her the next morning and said, "I need someone better at this than me." She called me back that evening from her office in downtown Toronto, her voice low. "Dad, I pulled what I could with the tools I have access to. He's running a franchise investment model that looks a lot like the Canmore one. He's taken about $3.1 million in so-called franchise fees from around 20 individual investors in the last 2 years. Most of them small business owners in the interior, some of them retired teachers. The filings with the BCSC are either incomplete or non-existent, and Dad Bennett's name is on the guest list as best man. He sent me a picture of the Tux last week. I closed my eyes. 20 families. Some of them people on fixed incomes, about to lose what they'd saved, because they'd trusted a smile and a linen shirt, and my son, who just made junior partner. They was about to stand up at the front of a winery in the Okanagan and publicly endorse the man running the scheme. In a consulting industry that lives and dies by reputation, that was going to follow him for the rest of his career. I sat on the porch that night with the stars bright the way they only get out here. And I thought about it. Hard. My first instinct was to let Bennett fall. He'd called me a coward. He'd believed his mother over 30 years of evidence. Maybe he needed to hit the rocks himself before he'd look at the chart. But the thing is, when it's your kid, you don't actually get to think that way for very long. You think it, and then you put it down. And then you pick up the phone. I phoned Bennett the next morning. He let it ring through to voicemail. I left a message that said, "Bennett, it's your father. I'm not calling to talk about your mother or me. I'm calling because I'm worried about a business concern regarding Travis. Please call me back." He didn't. I phoned again that evening. He answered, and his voice was hostile from the first syllable. "Dad, I'm not interested in whatever this is. Mom warned me you might try something. I'm just asking you to look at some public records." I said, "BC Securities Commission. Corporate Registry. Run the names, Travis Kellerman and Travis Kelman, with 2 different spellings." He said, "You're unbelievable. You disappear for 6 months and now you want to blow up Mom's wedding," and he hung up. I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, and my heart slower than it should have been. That was when I knew I couldn't save him from inside his own story. Somebody outside it would have to speak. I still had the business card of a man named Gordon Sinclair, a semi-retired securities lawyer from Toronto who'd handled due diligence for my company sale. 71 years old. Silver hair. The kind of presence that made rooms get quiet when he cleared his throat. I'd stayed in light touch with him, Christmas cards, the occasional email. He'd told me once, after a deal went sideways, that if I ever needed a favor that required a grown-up, I should call. I called. We talked for an hour. I sent him the files Margaret had pulled together, the BCSC notices, the corporate filings, the old Canmore settlement, the supplier's small claims. He read them overnight. The next morning he phoned back and said, "Douglas, I'm going to be in the Okanagan that weekend anyway. I have a cousin in Summerland I owe a visit. I'll come to the rehearsal dinner as a family friend if someone can get me on the list. I'll speak carefully. No accusation. Just questions. The kind that can be asked in public and answered in public. If the foundation is as weak as these documents suggest, The questions will be enough. Margaret handled the guest list. My ex-wife's cousin Valerie had always liked me and had always disliked my ex-wife, which is a more common combination than you'd think in a family. Valerie got Gordon added as her +1. Old friend of the family. Retired lawyer. In town for a visit. Nobody questioned it. My ex-wife didn't even notice the name. She was too busy arguing with the florist. The rehearsal dinner was on the Friday night before the wedding. 40-odd people at a long table on a vineyard patio overlooking Okanagan Lake. Early October. Warm day. Cool evening. The kind of light that makes everything photograph beautifully. I was 3,000 kilometers away on my porch in Blue Rocks. With a glass of water and my phone on the arm of the chair. Margaret was not there in person. She'd declined the invitation weeks earlier on the grounds that she had a work deadline, which was true and also convenient. Her husband's cousin, who lived in Penticton, was texting her updates. Margaret relayed them to me. 7:15 Pacific. Bennett gave the first toast, talked about his mother finding happiness, talked about Travis being the kind of man who walked the walk, who'd built something from nothing, who'd shown him what real integrity in business looked like. Didn't mention me once. 7:40. Gordon stood up and asked if he could say a few words. Valerie had warmed the table up for him. Old family friend. Don't mind the gray hair. A few words from a man who's seen a lot of weddings. Travis. Magnanimous. Waved him up. Gordon took the microphone and thanked everyone. He congratulated my ex-wife on her evening and said he'd known her family a long time, which was half true. Then he turned to Travis. I understand, he said, that you've built something remarkable in a very short time. 3 studios, a supplement business. Ils a franchise programme. That kind of growth is impressive. And it makes an old lawyer curious, because I've spent 40 years watching businesses grow. And there are usually only 2 ways to do it that quickly. Either you have significant personal capital, or you have a lot of other people's money, which is your situation. If you don't mind me asking, Margaret's cousin-in-law texted room went quiet. Travis laughed, but it was tight. Said he'd been blessed with good investors. Gordon nodded. Then he said, I ask because I spent an hour this morning on the BC Securities Commission website, and there's a cease trade order from last year against a numbered company I believe is associated with your holdings. There are also registered liens against 2 of the studios for unpaid source deductions to CRA, which is the sort of thing that worries me when employees are involved. And I noticed that your former business in Alberta, under the name Kelman, settled a class action in 2021. I'm not making any accusations tonight. I'm just asking, have your current investors been told about any of that? Because if they haven't, they might want to ask before the weekend's out. Then he raised his glass. To the happy couple, he said, and to transparency, which in my experience is the only foundation that holds in the long run. You could hear forks hitting plates 2 tables over. What I didn't know in real time, what I only saw on video the next morning, was one of the bridesmaids had been live streaming the toasts on her Instagram. She didn't cut the stream. The whole thing went out live, then got clipped and reposted by a dozen accounts within the hour. Then picked up by a couple of Canadian lifestyle and business pages that specialized in outing wellness grifters. By 2 a.m. Pacific time, it had 800,000 views. By the time I woke up on Saturday, it was past 2 million. The comments were brutal, not at my ex-wife. At Travis. People had already pulled the old Alberta settlement. People had already found his real name. 2 of his investors had already posted on their own accounts asking for their money back. The wedding technically still happened on the Saturday, but only about 60 of the 150 guests showed up, and several of them left before the ceremony was over. My ex-wife's best friend since university, a woman named Caroline, reportedly stood up during the vows and walked out. Bennett went through the motions, as best man, but his face in the photos that leaked later looked like a man who'd been hit in the stomach and was still standing up on principle. My ex-wife's call came at around 1 a.m. Atlantic time on Sunday. I'd gone to bed early. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. her name on the screen for the first time in 6 months. I picked up and said nothing. She was sobbing and screaming at the same time. That particular sound she made when she wanted to win and lose simultaneously. You did this. You planted him. You couldn't let me have one good thing. You destroyed my life. I let her finish. I actually let her get all the way to the end. And then I said, quietly, I'm sitting on a porch on the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know any lawyer named Gordon Sinclair personally. If he said what he said it because public records said it first. Maybe somebody in your life should have asked those questions before today. I hope you're all right. I'm going back to sleep. And I hung up. I set the phone on the nightstand and lay there listening to the foghorn out on Cross Island. And I waited for guilt to land. And it didn't. What landed instead was sadness, not for her. For the 32 years we'd both wasted trying to make something that didn't want to be made. I fell back asleep around 3. Margaret kept me posted over the next few days. The BCSC opened a formal investigation on the Monday. Travis's podcast got pulled by its platform by Tuesday. 2 of the 3 studios had their landlords start eviction proceedings by Friday. The rent hadn't been paid in 3 months. The investors organized on a private Facebook group and retained a litigation firm in Vancouver. 2 of them were CBC-affiliated journalist parents, which was how the story ended up on a national broadcast. By the following Thursday, Travis had disappeared from social media by then. The marriage, as far as anyone could tell from the outside, there was already in some kind of legal limbo. She'd signed a prenup at his insistence that now looked a lot less like protection for her and a lot more like a trap, because it meant any community assets were going to be frozen along with his. Bennett phoned me on a Wednesday, 8 days after the wedding. His voice was small, not Osteel. Small. Dad. He said my name and then couldn't get any further. I said, I'm here. Bennett. Take your time. He told me his firm had called him in, not fired him, but asked him to take 2 weeks of personal leave while they did a review. His face was in a lot of the leaked video. He'd given the toast. He was best man. In consulting, you live on the cleanliness of your judgment. I didn't check. Dad, he said. I didn't check him out. I didn't verify anything. She told me he was wonderful. And I took her word for it. Like I took her word for he stopped. Like I took her word for a lot of things. I said, Bennett, there isn't a person alive who hasn't taken somebody's word for something they shouldn't have. The question isn't whether you made the mistake. The question is what you do with it. He cried a little on the phone. I haven't heard my son cry since he was about 9. I told him what I wish somebody had told me at 25, that being wrong about a person isn't a moral failure. It's a data problem. And you solve data problems by being willing to look at information that hurts. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Dad, can I come out there? I said, yes. I have a spare room. You can come out whenever you want. He flew into Halifax the next month. I picked him up at the airport and we drove down the South Shore in the rain. And we didn't say much for the first hour. Then somewhere around Chester, he started talking. About his mother, about the things he'd been told about me that didn't line up with what he was now starting to see for himself, about the fact that he'd always felt like his job as the youngest was to keep her happy, and how much energy that had taken, and how he'd blamed me for not doing enough of it. We stayed up until 2 a.m. that first night. I didn't try to correct his memories. I didn't defend myself. I just let him talk. By the end of the week, something had rearranged between us. Not fixed. Exactly. Rearranged. That was 18 months ago. I'm writing this, telling you this, from the same porch in Blue Rocks. The view hasn't changed. The fog still comes in most mornings and burns off by 10. But a few things have. Travis Kellerman was charged by the BCSC in the spring, and separately by the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team with fraud over $5,000. His trial is set for the fall. He's out on condition. Staying with a brother in Saskatchewan. Not allowed within 100 kilometers of any of his former businesses. The civil suit from the investors settled for about 68 cents on the dollar, which is better than most of these end up. My ex-wife was named as a co-defendant in one of the civil suits because a portion of investor money had been used to pay for the wedding and for jewelry gifted to her in the months leading up. She settled by forfeiting the jewelry and agreeing to a payment plan. The Oakville house was sold last December. I got the news from Margaret because she couldn't afford the upkeep on her design income alone. And the cottage her parents left her went on the market 2 months later. She lives in a townhouse in Burlington now, working for a design firm instead of running her own practice. Margaret tells me she's cordial but distant when they see each other at Christmas. I have no contact with her and don't plan to. Bennett left the consulting firm after his review. He took a job at a smaller shop in Toronto that he likes better. He comes out to Nova Scotia twice a year now. Once in summer. Once at Christmas. Last August he brought a woman named Priya, an ER physician he'd been seeing for about 6 months. Steady. Kind. Funny in a dry way. The kind of woman who looks at a person and actually sees them. He proposed to her in February. He called me first. He said, "Dad, I want to ask you to stand up for me." I said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding is next June, here in Nova Scotia. Small, at a friend's farm outside Mahone Bay. Margaret's giving the toast. I'm just going to sit there and be glad. Margaret made partner last year. She phones every Sunday, and sometimes in between. She started talking about buying a little place out here for weekends. She says she wants her kids, when she has them, to know a coast that isn't a condo view. I'd like that. As for me, I'm healthy. Blood pressure, 115/70, last checkup. I sleep 8 hours a night unless there's a storm. And when there's a storm, I like being awake for it. I've gotten reasonably good at making cutting boards and passably bad at watercolor. I teach a volunteer shop class for teenagers at the Lunenburg Community Center twice a month. I drink my coffee at Eileen's most mornings. I've got a small circle, a retired fisherman named Ross, who I play cribbage with on Thursdays. A woman named Harriet, who runs the co-op and makes me laugh. A couple of expats from Toronto who moved out here around the same time I did. I'm not in a relationship, and I'm not looking. That might change. It might not. I'm not in a hurry. I feel no bitterness towards my ex-wife. That surprised me more than anything. I just don't think about her. When I do, it's the way you think about weather in a city you used to live in occasional. Abstract. Not personnel. People sometimes ask me if I'm happy out here. Living alone. This far from where I built my career. I don't think happy is quite the word for it. Content. Maybe. At peace. Definitely. I spent 32 years making myself smaller so somebody else could look bigger. And I convinced myself that was what love required. I was wrong. Love doesn't require you to disappear. Anybody who tells you it does is selling you something you shouldn't be buying. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I think there is, it's a simple one. The things that are real will survive scrutiny. The things that aren't, won't. That's true of a marriage. It's true of a business. It's true of a person. When somebody tells you who they are with their actions, with the gaps in their story, with the questions they don't want, asked, believe them the first time. Don't wait for your body to do the believing for you. Don't wait for a stroke scare in a Mississauga emergency room. Don't wait 32 years. Check the foundation before you build the house. It's not cynicism. It's the opposite. It's the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for everybody who loves you. These stories aren't just stories. They're things some of us paid for in years we're not getting back. And if telling them spares somebody a single one of those years, then they're worth telling. If any of this landed for you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. And tell me the thing you're trying to decide whether to walk away from. I read them. I really do. If you want more like this one, there are plenty more on the channel. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.